Alright, YouTube, so we are back, of course, to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So obviously, it has been a while since we put out a video. I believe it's been exactly 2 weeks to the day since I last put out a video. Obviously, over 2 weeks ago, I put out a community post about being sick. Turns out I had COVID. That takes about 2 weeks to kind of get over, and I believe it's almost 2 weeks to the day that when I started feeling symptoms, that I actually got over it. Which was earlier this week, but I took a couple extra days before, getting into making videos and content again, just to make sure that I was good to go. And I've been feeling normal for the past 2 or 3 days. So I was like, fuck it, let's get back into making some videos. Since I really won't ever get a chance to talk about this anywhere else, my personal experience with COVID, I don't know if you've had it or know anybody that has had it. It pretty much felt like the flu, like the few times I've had the flu in my life. It felt like that for 2 weeks. I know it affects people differently. Some people lose their sense of smell, their taste, things like that. Obviously, some people get hospitalized and all kinds of shit. None of that happened to me. I just felt sick for 2 weeks. I was nauseous, headache, low energy, didn't have an appetite. There's very often that I would go for 24 hours or more without eating because nothing sounded good, and I have to force myself to eat at times. And then just one day, earlier this week, I woke up and was pretty much normal. So I had a little bit of symptoms for a day, day and a half or something like that. And then it was gone. It just passed like it never happened. It's super weird. There's a point to all this, why I'm explaining all this and talking about it. Even though I've been sick for 2 weeks and haven't been uploading content, I've still been looking into Remake, looking up, the usual stuff, Google, Reddit, Twitter, stuff like that. And to be honest, the whole time I've been sick, there's really not been anything to talk about anyways. It's super weird how, once I got sick, there was just no information or anything interesting to discuss anyways, even if I wasn't sick. But of course, we're here today because there is something to talk about. There's a recent interview from Square Enix with Kazushika Nojima, who of course is the scenario writer for a shit ton of Final Fantasy games, but specifically for the Final Fantasy VII, I believe maybe the entire compilation, but also of course Remake, and he did write the Trace of Two Paths book that recently came out. So this interview is entirely about the light novel, kind of the inspiration for why he made it, but also it kind of vaguely touches on the idea of writing more books about more characters in the future, which is kind of the biggest talking point I believe from this interview. It's not a super long interview. We're going to read over parts of it, of course. We're not going to read the entire thing because of course the entire thing isn't worth reading. In terms of information for a YouTube video, we don't need to read the entire thing. But if you want to read the entire interview, you can. The translations, of course, come to us from Audrey over on Twitter. And really quickly before we actually entirely hop into this, Audrey made really big translations like this, so when you zoom in on it too much, it gets blurry and kind of shitty looking, so I don't know how it's going to turn out in the video. We can't zoom in super far to crop questions and answers, or it's going to look like shit. Anyways, let's hop into it. The last Final Fantasy VII light novel you wrote was the Final Fantasy VII Turks, The Kids Are Alright, which was written in 2011, and 10 years have passed since then. Can you let us know what made you go back to writing light novels, and the reason why you decided to write Final Fantasy VII Remake Traces of Two Paths? I received offers to do so on several occasions, and I just felt that I had to write it. I was able to find time to write, which got me moving forward. So a couple things here. For one, I didn't realize it's already been 10 years since The Kids Are Alright came out. I know it's a little bit older of a book, but I didn't realize it's been a whole decade, man. Secondly, he said he's had several offers or occasions where people have wanted him to write more light novels. And I wonder specifically if they were just wanting more FF7 light novels. As in, and maybe it didn't matter what it's about as long as it's related to FF7, it's a book that can sell or whatever, expands the story. Or if whoever was making these offers specifically wanted a book about Tifa and Aerith. Let's talk about the book's contents first. The two stories are Traces of Tifa and Traces of Aerith, which revolve around Tifa and Aerith's childhood before the start of FF7R. When did you decide on the outline of the entire work? I came up with the synopsis around summer of 2020 if my memory serves correctly. The final version is quite different from the draft though. So the main reason I wanted to read that one is that he came up with a synopsis for this light novel just a little over a year ago. Summer of 2020 is when he's first conceptualizing this book. And then within the span of about a year, a little over a year, the book gets fully written, published, and is already sold to people. That, to me, that's pretty goddamn impressive. It's not a small book. It's 288 pages, so almost 300 pages. That's a decent sized book. And I guess I also thought that this book was conceptualized for a while now, a couple years at this point, because obviously Remake, has been in the works since before 2015 when we first got the reveal. So that's been, a long, long time at this point. And in my head, as somebody who doesn't write books, obviously, I think it takes a really, really long time. But obviously, he's a scenario writer for video games and has been for a long time. He's written light novels in the past before. So I guess for him, it's a lot easier than it would be for someone like me. If I were to write a book, it would take me a long ass time. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Aside from the story being a prequel of sorts, are there any other important points to note? As you probably know, Final Fantasy VII is comprised of many different works, and each time when something new is added, it's either a setting or episode. However, FF7R has taken those elements and rebuilt them. This light novel takes place with that as its base instead. So this is something I hadn't even really considered. Despite the light novel being called Final Fantasy VII Remake, Trace of Two Paths, I hadn't really thought about the setting of the book itself specifically being within the remake story, as opposed to just the overall FF7 story. Which there is a difference there, even if they're very similar in a lot of ways. Of course, characters within Remake have more knowledge than their FF7 counterparts, and of course with Remake potentially being a sequel to the entire compilation itself, some sort of follow-up to the last thing that happened within the compilation before Remake, that matters a lot in terms of storytelling when it comes to writing the novel. Are there any differences between game scenarios, light novels, or other media, such as movies, stage plays, etc., that you have felt when trying to come up with a story? Scenarios are the blueprint of games, movies, and stage plays that involve others too. However, with light novels, the entire story is relying on the person writing it without much involvement from others, so I think that's a really big difference. It also depends on the scope of the knowledge from the readers. For example, how much do they know about the world of Final Fantasy VII? This always presents challenges each time I tackle it because it determines what I should or should not write. For example, if I spend too much time building up the environments, then it would take up way too many pages, and the story would not progress at all. So there's not really a whole lot to break down here. I just like getting his perspective on the difference between writing scenarios for a book or light novel versus video games and movies and stuff. It's kind of interesting to get the scenario writer himself's perspective on that. But I did also find it interesting that he takes into consideration what people may or may not know about Final Fantasy VII as a whole when it comes to scenario writing for things like that. And when it comes to writing a book, he explains how you can't spend too much time building up an environment or explain stuff too much because it's going to take up too many pages and the story's not going to go anywhere. So pretty much whenever you're writing the book, you got to take into consideration, when it comes to Tifa and Aerith, you got to assume that the people that are reading this book already know a pretty good amount about Tifa and Aerith themselves, so you don't have to spend too much of the book explaining who these characters are. Do you have plans to write any more light novels in the future? The difficulties I felt up until the final draft are still fresh in my mind, but I guess I should probably forget about that with these light novels. Now, Audrey did do a follow-up tweet about that specific answer that says, a revision to the line, I should probably forget that with these light novels, should be when I probably forget that while writing light novels. So a much better translation comes from Dualshockers.com that says, writing these novels is incredibly difficult, and all the pain I felt till reaching the final manuscript is still fresh in my mind. I'll start thinking about future novels once I start forgetting that pain. So essentially he's saying it's pretty difficult to write the book, and once he's kind of over the pain it took, the effort it took to write the book, he might consider writing more books in the future. For example, what about something like Traces of Yuffie or other stories? Aside from Yuffie, the remaining characters are all older guys, I guess. Would that be alright? Vincent would probably be rather interesting. So again, this is probably the most interesting thing from this interview is the possibility of future books, specifically maybe a Yuffie book or a Vincent book, which they were optional characters when it came to the original FF7, of course, so they're technically in a lot of ways need more character development, but I feel like we know a lot about Vincent, right? And you could say the same thing about Tifa and Aerith, who of course just got their own light novels, but I feel like I would rather there be, light novels and supplemental materials that go into more, character development for characters that don't have a lot. What about Kate, Sith, and Reeve, right? What about Sid? I feel like we don't know a lot about the character of Sid. We know his backstory a bit, of course, right? Worked for Shinder, space program, all that other stuff. But still, we don't know a lot about that character, and I wouldn't mind getting some history on him. And also, why not non-main characters in terms of, characters we control? Why not some more Turk-related stuff or Shin-related stuff? The character of, President Shinner or Rufus. Or what about a book about Bugenhagen? That'd be fucking interesting. That's a really cool character that we don't know a lot about. It doesn't always have to be about the main party. I feel like a book, or a light novel, 200-300 pages about Bugenhagen could tell us so goddamn much. And also writing a book specifically about Bugenhagen would probably give us more backstory on the character of Red 13 and maybe even Seto or just in general Red 13 species. You could do a lot with that. Cosmo Canyon as well. The history on that location. Bugenhagen is just the first character that came to mind when I'm trying to think of a character outside of the main protagonist and antagonist. And I just feel like you could do so much with him. And even though we do know a lot about the character of Barrett, I feel like you could do a book about his past that'd be kind of interesting because, again, I always forget until I think about it in the moment when I'm talking in videos and stuff. The Barrett used to have a fucking wife, right? Back in the day. Old school Corel before Shinner fucked it up. He had a wife. Where's that story, dude? I want to learn about Barrett's past, or what about Cloud's dad, if you want to do a book about Cloud? What's up with that, right? We don't know shit about Cloud's dad other than he died. I don't know, there's a couple ideas off the top of my head. That's pretty much the interview. It's pretty much the video, my dudes. So, I'll pass it off to you guys. A question for you guys. If Nojima were to write more light novels in the future, which characters would you specifically like to see? The video's already kind of long, but we also haven't put out a video in a while, so I don't really mind too much. Either way, my dudes, that is the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you guys already want to do more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, dashingdavidYT. I'm on Discord. Links to social networks are in the description. And in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like low